Elemental practices represent sophisticated technologies for psychological transformation, developed through centuries of what we might call experiential research, careful observation of how specific practices affect consciousness, emotion, cognition, and behavior. Far from being primitive superstitions or simplistic rituals, these approaches demonstrate profound psychological insight across diverse cultural contexts. In this chapter, we'll explore these elemental technologies through multiple complementary lenses. We'll examine traditional practices from various cultures, especially pagan and neo-pagan traditions that have preserved elemental wisdom. We'll consider the psychological mechanisms that make these practices effective, drawing on insights from contemporary neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and therapeutic modalities. And we'll explore how modern approaches have adapted traditional techniques to address contemporary needs, often rediscovering through scientific research what traditional wisdom had recognized through generations of experience. The goal isn't to choose between traditional and contemporary, spiritual and psychological, but to recognize how these different approaches can inform and enrich each other. Across vastly different cultures and historical periods, a striking pattern emerges. Human beings universally recognize the psychological necessity of what we might call ground, a stable foundation of embodied presence and connection to physical reality. This cross-cultural consistency extends to the bodily approaches developed for establishing ground. Sitting or standing with conscious attention to the contact between body and earth. Slow, deliberate movement that brings awareness to physical sensation, the use of weight, pressure, or rhythmic motion to heighten sensory awareness. These basic techniques appear with remarkable similarity across otherwise different traditions. From a neurobiological perspective, these grounding practices make perfect sense. When we bring conscious attention to sensory contact with our physical environment, we activate neural networks associated with present moment awareness and embodied cognition. What's particularly interesting is how the manifestation of deficient earth energy appears similarly across different cultural contexts. Whether described as untethered, ungrounded, dissociated, or disconnected from the body, the experience shows consistent features: racing thoughts, anxiety, difficulty completing tasks, feeling not quite here, and challenges with practical matters. Pagan traditions, both ancient and contemporary, have developed sophisticated technologies for engaging with earth energy through ritual practice. Among the most visible are stone structures, from massive henges like Stonehenge to simple standing stones that mark landscapes across Europe and beyond. In contemporary practice, stone remains an important medium for earth connection. The creation of stone circles for ritual work, the use of crystals and minerals as focalized earth energy, and the practice of cairn building as meditation all represent ways of engaging with the particularly stable, enduring quality of earth as expressed through stone. Salt represents another important earth element in ritual contexts used for purification, protection, and boundary setting. The practice of casting a circle with salt before ritual work establishes not only a symbolic, but an energetic boundary that helps create psychological container. Burial and planting rituals provide yet another approach to earth energy, using the transformative properties of soil to facilitate psychological change. The ritual burial of objects representing unwanted patterns or aspects of self, or the planting of seeds representing intentions for growth, engages the Earth's capacity to both decompose what is no longer needed and nurture new developments. Understanding the psychological mechanisms underlying these traditional practices helps us appreciate their sophistication. Far from being superstitious or primitive, these approaches demonstrate nuanced understanding of how embodied ritual actions can facilitate psychological processes that might be difficult to access through purely cognitive means. Contemporary psychology has developed its own approaches to grounding and embodiment, often unknowingly paralleling traditional earth practices while expressing them through different conceptual frameworks. Grounding techniques are now standard interventions in trauma treatment, anxiety management, and mindfulness practice. Somatic psychology represents a particularly important rediscovery of embodiment principles long recognized in traditional earth practices. Pioneers like Peter Levine, Pat Ogden, and Bessel van der Kolk have demonstrated how trauma and other psychological issues manifest in physical patterns that can't be adequately addressed through purely verbal or cognitive approaches. The integration of traditional knowledge with contemporary understanding creates particularly powerful approaches to earth work. When we understand both the traditional wisdom of earth as foundation and the neurobiological mechanisms through which grounding regulates the nervous system, we can engage with these practices in ways that honor their spiritual dimensions while benefiting from scientific insights about their effects. To illustrate the complementary nature of traditional and contemporary approaches to earth energy, consider a comparison between a traditional earth ritual and a modern grounding technique. In the traditional approach, participants might sit in a circle, place hands on the ground, and visualize roots extending from their bodies deep into the earth, while inviting connection with earth spirits or ancestors. In the contemporary approach, a therapist might guide a client to notice the sensations where their body contacts the chair or floor, to feel the weight and support of gravity, and to attend to the solidity of their physical presence. Though expressed through different language and conceptual frameworks, these approaches share fundamental psychological principles. Rather than seeing these approaches as contradictory or competing, we can recognize how they complement each other. The traditional approach may offer richer symbolism, cultural context, and spiritual framing that provides meaning and depth. The contemporary approach may offer clearer understanding of neurobiological mechanisms and more direct application to specific psychological challenges. Fire's transformative power has been recognized across cultures as both literal reality and psychological metaphor. The ability of fire to fundamentally change what it touches, turning solid to ash, hard to soft, raw to cooked, makes it a universal symbol for transformation in human consciousness and circumstances. The psychological dimensions of fire rituals across traditions reveal sophisticated understanding of how transformative processes work in the human psyche. Fire ceremonies often involve the ritual destruction of objects, representing what needs to be released or transformed, externally enacting the internal process of letting go. They frequently include elements of purification, recognizing that transformation often requires clearing away accumulated patterns before new growth can emerge, and they typically incorporate communal witnessing, acknowledging the important role of social context in supporting and validating personal change. From a neuroscience perspective, the motivational aspects of fire energy correspond to dopaminergic systems that drive goal-directed behavior, reward anticipation, and the experience of enthusiasm and passion. Practices that activate and direct these systems, whether traditional fire ceremonies or contemporary motivational techniques, help mobilize psychological resources for change. Perhaps most interesting are the universal patterns in working with resistance to change that appear across different fire traditions. Whether expressed as feeding the fire in traditional contexts or working with resistance in therapeutic settings, there's recognition that transformation requires ongoing attention to the forces that both drive and impede change. Among the most dramatic expressions of fire energy in pagan traditions are the seasonal fire festivals, particularly Beltane, May 1st, with its bonfires, fire jumping, and celebration of passion and fertility. These festivals aren't merely calendar markers, but sophisticated psychological technologies for engaging with specific qualities of fire energy, at times when those qualities are particularly accessible in the natural world. Candle magic represents a more intimate and focused fire practice common across many traditions. The simple act of setting an intention while lighting a candle creates a powerful psychological anchor for manifestation work. The flame becomes a focal point for concentration and its transformative quality, turning solid wax to light and heat. symbolizes the transformation of intention into reality. Forge work and metallurgy provide another rich source of fire symbolism and practice. The transformation of raw metal into tools or art through the application of intense heat parallels psychological processes of pressure, transformation, and emergence. The psychological principles underlying traditional fire ceremonies are sophisticated and multifaceted. They recognize the power of declared intention, especially when witnessed by community. They understand how symbolic action can mobilize subconscious resources for change. They acknowledge the importance of timing, working with natural cycles that support different types of transformation. Contemporary approaches to motivation and transformation often parallel traditional fire practices, though expressed through different conceptual frameworks. Visualization techniques, affirmations, goal-setting practices, and various approaches to behavior change all seek to harness the psychological energy traditionally associated with fire. Cognitive behavioral approaches incorporate fire wisdom in their focus on activating behavior as a pathway to psychological change. Rather than waiting for motivation to emerge before taking action, CBT often prescribes action as a way to generate motivation, a principle that aligns with traditional understanding of how ritual action with fire can catalyze internal transformation. Visualization practices represent a particularly clear parallel between traditional and contemporary approaches. Whether visualizing energy moving through chakras in yogic traditions, imagining candle flames transmuting obstacles in ceremonial magic, or using guided imagery to enhance performance in sports psychology, these approaches recognize the power of focused mental imagery to catalyze real change in experience and behavior. The integration of ancient fire wisdom with contemporary understanding of change processes creates particularly effective approaches to transformation. When we understand both the symbolic power of fire as an archetype of transformation and the neurological mechanisms through which visualization and goal-directed activity affect behavior, we can design practices that engage both these dimensions. To illustrate the complementary relationship between traditional and contemporary approaches to fire energy, consider a comparison between a Beltane fire-jumping ritual and a modern transformational coaching technique. In the traditional approach, participants might write aspects of themselves they wish to transform on pieces of paper, cast these into a bonfire while stating their intention for change, and then leap over a smaller fire to embody their commitment to transformation. In the contemporary approach, a coach might guide a client to identify limiting beliefs, create specific goals for change, develop implementation intentions for new behaviors, and establish accountability structures to support their transformation. These approaches can complement rather than contradict each other in supporting transformation. The traditional approach offers rich symbolism, community witness, and connection to seasonal energies that may provide deeper meaning and emotional resonance to the change process. The contemporary approach offers specificity, structured follow-through, and cognitive frameworks that may help translate initial inspiration into sustained change. Air, though invisible, is immediately recognized across cultures as essential to both physical life and psychological well-being. The relationship between breath and life, between wind and change, between clear skies and clear thinking appears in practices from diverse traditions worldwide. The psychological dimensions of air practices reflect sophisticated understanding of cognitive processes. Breath regulation affects the autonomic nervous system, shifting brain activity patterns in ways that enhance attention, reduce anxiety, and increase cognitive flexibility. Practices that engage with air as metaphor and medium, speaking intentions aloud, writing thoughts to clarify them, using sound or music to shift consciousness, utilize the connection between verbal, auditory processing and conceptual thinking that contemporary neuroscience confirms as fundamental to human cognition. From a neuroscience perspective, air practices engage neural networks associated with language, working memory, perspective taking, and mental flexibility. The prefrontal cortical regions involved in these functions depend on optimal arousal states that traditional air practices help induce through breath regulation, attention training, and other techniques. perhaps most universal, is the recognition across traditions that air represents both our greatest freedom and our greatest challenge. The same mental capacity that allows us to imagine possibilities beyond our current circumstances can also trap us in rumination, worry, and disconnection from embodied reality. The invocation of air quarters or directions forms an essential component of creating sacred space in many pagan traditions. Typically associated with the East, air is often called upon at the beginning of ritual work to bring qualities of clarity, fresh perspective, and mental alertness to the proceedings. Incense and smoke represent one of the most widespread air tools across spiritual traditions. The rising smoke provides a visible manifestation of the otherwise invisible air element, while the aromatic compounds stimulate the olfactory system, one of our most direct pathways to memory and emotion. Divination practices represent another important category of air work, providing methods for accessing different kinds of knowing than ordinary linear thought. Whether through tarot cards, runestones, scrying, or other methods, these practices create conditions for what contemporary psychology might call intuitive or non-linear cognitive processing, the recognition of patterns and connections that may not be immediately accessible to conscious reasoning. The psychological mechanisms underlying traditional air workings are multifaceted. They engage the power of ritual language to frame experience and set intention. They utilize sensory pathways like scent and sound that can bypass conscious filters and directly affect emotional and cognitive states. They create conditions for altered states of consciousness that facilitate access to non-ordinary ways of knowing. Contemporary psychology has developed numerous approaches to mental clarity and cognitive flexibility that parallel traditional air practices, though expressed through different conceptual frameworks. Mindfulness techniques train attention and awareness in ways similar to meditative breath practices from various traditions. Cognitive restructuring helps identify and modify thought patterns that create distress, much as traditional air rituals might be used to clear the air of negative influences. Cognitive therapy approaches incorporate air wisdom through their focus on how thought patterns shape experience and behavior. The core principle that changing thoughts can change emotional states and actions aligns with traditional understanding of air as the element that shapes reality through intention and perception. Techniques like cognitive diffusion, learning to observe thoughts rather than being captured by them, parallel traditional practices that cultivate witness consciousness through breath awareness and meditation. These contemporary approaches integrate well with traditional knowledge about how air energy affects human experience. When we understand both the symbolic associations of air with mental activity and the neurobiological mechanisms through which breath regulation affects cognitive function, we can develop practices that honor both dimensions. To illustrate the complementary relationship between traditional and contemporary approaches to air energy, consider a comparison between a traditional air ritual and a modern cognitive technique for enhancing mental clarity. In the traditional approach, a practitioner might sit in the eastern quarter of a sacred circle, burn clarifying incense like sage or rosemary, use a feather to direct the smoke while visualizing mental cobwebs being cleared away, and then write insights on parchment to externalize their newfound clarity. In the contemporary approach, a person might practice a mindfulness meditation focused on observing thoughts without attachment, identify cognitive distortions using a CBT framework, and then journal using prompted questions designed to elicit balanced perspective. These approaches, though outwardly different, share fundamental psychological principles. Both create intentional space for stepping back from automatic thought patterns. Both use external tools to facilitate internal processes. Both recognize the value of externalizing thoughts through writing. Rather than seeing these as competing approaches, we can recognize how they complement each other in addressing different dimensions of mental clarity. The traditional approach may offer richer sensory engagement, symbolic resonance, and connection to spiritual dimensions of clarity. The contemporary approach may provide more explicit cognitive frameworks, structured reflection tools, and evidence-based techniques for addressing specific thinking patterns. Water's association with emotion and intuition appears with remarkable consistency across diverse cultures and spiritual traditions. From baptismal rites to ritual bathing, from sacred wells to ceremonial chalices, practices involving water as both physical substance and psychological symbol reflect cross-cultural recognition of its connection to the fluid, flowing aspects of human experience that lie beneath rational consciousness. The psychological dimensions of water rituals reveal sophisticated understanding of emotional processes. Immersion in water, whether literal in baptism and ritual bathing, or symbolic through visualization and ceremonial vessels, represents surrender to deeper currents of feeling and knowing. The reflective surface of still water parallels the contemplative awareness that allows access to intuitive wisdom. The cleansing property of water embodies emotional release and renewal. From a neuroscience perspective, the emotional and intuitive aspects of water energy correspond to limbic and right hemispheric brain functions that process experience in ways different from logical, linear thought. Practices that engage with water energy, whether through traditional rituals or contemporary therapeutic approaches, help access these emotional and intuitive processing systems. Universal patterns in emotional processing appear across different water traditions. Whether expressed as emotional release in contemporary therapy, catharsis in classical traditions, or cleansing in ritual contexts, there's recognition that emotions need to flow rather than stagnate for psychological health. Similarly, the understanding that intuitive wisdom emerges through receptivity rather than active seeking appears across diverse approaches to water energy. Holy wells and sacred springs represent some of the most enduring sites of water reverence in European traditions. Often associated with healing, divination, and connection with divine feminine energies, these sites have maintained their significance through enormous cultural changes. Many Christian churches were deliberately built near sacred wells that have been venerated since pre-Christian times. The chalice and cauldron hold central importance in ceremonial contexts across many traditions. The chalice, containing water or other liquids, represents the receptive aspect of consciousness that allows for emotional depth and intuitive wisdom. The cauldron, with its transformative mixing and brewing of elements, embodies the alchemical potential of emotional experience to transform consciousness when properly contained and worked with. Scrying and reflective divination, gazing into still water, dark mirrors, or similar reflective surfaces to access intuitive knowledge, represent sophisticated psychological technologies for accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness. The slight visual ambiguity of reflective surfaces, combined with relaxed, receptive attention, creates optimal conditions for what contemporary psychology might call right hemispheric processing or primary process thinking. The psychological mechanisms underlying these traditional water ceremonies are multifaceted and sophisticated. They utilize sensory experience, the feeling of water on skin, the sound of flowing streams, the sight of reflective surfaces, to shift consciousness away from ordinary, verbal, dominant states. They create symbolic containers for emotional experience, helping to maintain the balance between excessive containment, emotional suppression, and insufficient containment, emotional flooding. Contemporary approaches to emotional intelligence and regulation parallel many traditional water practices, though expressed through different conceptual frameworks. Emotion-focused therapy, affect regulation techniques, and various approaches to developing emotional literacy all seek to create healthier relationship with the realm of feeling traditionally associated with water. Emotion-focused therapy incorporates water wisdom through its emphasis on fully experiencing, rather than avoiding or intellectualizing emotions. The therapeutic principle that emotions need to be fully felt before they can transform aligns with traditional understanding of water as an element that must flow to remain healthy. Techniques for accessing and working with primary emotions beneath defensive reactions parallel traditional practices for connecting with deeper emotional currents beneath surface disturbances. Intuition development exercises in contemporary contexts often demonstrate striking parallels with traditional water practices. Whether through body scanning techniques that tune into subtle physical sensations, dream work that engages with symbolic material from the unconscious, or reflective practices that quiet analytical thinking to allow subtler knowing to emerge, these approaches recognize the same principles that inform traditional divination and scrying practices. The integration of ancient water wisdom with contemporary understanding of emotional processing creates particularly effective approaches. When we understand both the symbolic power of water as an element of feeling and connection and the neurobiological mechanisms through which emotional regulation occurs, we can develop practices that honor both dimensions. To illustrate the complementary relationship between traditional and contemporary approaches to water energy, consider a comparison between a traditional water ritual and a modern emotional processing technique. In the traditional approach, a practitioner might create a small altar with a bowl of water collected from a sacred spring, add drops of essential oils associated with emotional healing, gaze into the water while entering a meditative state, and then speak aloud insights received about an emotional situation while visualizing emotional release into the water. In the contemporary approach, a person might practice mindful awareness of bodily sensations associated with an emotion, identify the primary feeling beneath defensive reactions, journal about the emotion without judgment, and then practice self-compassion exercises to integrate the emotional experience. Despite their different external forms, these approaches share fundamental psychological principles. Both create intentional space for attending to emotional experience rather than avoiding it. Both engage with bodily awareness as a pathway to emotional understanding. Both recognize the value of externalization in processing emotion, and both aim to transform the relationship with emotional experience rather than simply changing the emotion itself. Beyond practices focused on individual elements lies the essential work of integration, bringing earth, water, air, and fire into balanced relationship within the psyche. Cross-cultural practices for integrating elemental energies appear in diverse traditions, from the medicine wheel ceremonies of Native American traditions to the pentagram rituals of Western ceremonial magic, from the 5 elements practices of Chinese medicine to the chakra balancing techniques of yogic traditions. The psychological value of consciously balancing elements extends beyond simply developing individual qualities associated with each element. Integration practices recognize that the elements exist in relationship, that earth without water becomes rigid and brittle, water without fire lacks direction and purpose, fire without air burns out quickly, air without earth lacks practical application. The goal isn't simply to develop each elemental quality individually, but to create dynamic balance among them, allowing each to complement and moderate the others in a sustainable system. From a neuroscience perspective, integration practices engage with the balanced functioning of different neural networks and brain regions. The grounding qualities of Earth correspond to somatosensory networks and interoceptive awareness. The emotional flow of water engages limbic systems and right hemispheric processing. The mental clarity of air activates prefrontal networks involved in executive function and verbal processing. The transformative energy of fire involves dopaminergic motivation systems and motor planning areas. Universal patterns in approaches to psychological wholeness suggest that integration isn't merely a cultural construction, but reflects fundamental psychological realities, whether expressed as balance, harmony, wholeness, or completion. There's cross-cultural recognition that well-being emerges from the right relationship among different aspects of psyche, rather than from developing any single quality to its maximum. Creating sacred space, the ritual circle as integration technology. Circle casting and sacred space creation represent some of the most widespread integration technologies across spiritual traditions. Whether in the medicine wheel of Native American traditions, the magic circle of Western ceremonial practice, or the mandala of Eastern traditions, the creation of a circular space with elemental correspondences at cardinal points provides a powerful tool for psychological integration. The psychological function of ritual boundaries and elemental invocations operates on multiple levels. The boundary creation involved in circle casting helps establish psychological container, a sense of safety and containment that allows for deeper work. The directional elemental invocations systematically activate awareness of different psychological functions and energies, ensuring that none are neglected. The circular form itself embodies the concept of wholeness and completion, providing both symbolic representation and energetic experience of the integration being sought. Ceremonial structures facilitate integration of psychological aspects through their ordered progression of activities. Most ritual formats begin with grounding and centering, move through emotional connection and purification, proceed to setting clear intention and invocation, engage with transformative work, and conclude with integration practices that balance and harmonize the energies raised. Contemporary research on rituals' effects on psychological integration helps explain why these traditional practices have persisted across cultures and centuries. Studies show that ritual actions increase feelings of control and reduce anxiety in uncertain situations. The multisensory nature of ritual engages multiple neural networks simultaneously, promoting integration across different modes of processing. Modern adaptations, psychological integration practices. Contemporary psychology has developed numerous approaches to psychological integration and wholeness that parallel traditional practices in many respects. Holistic therapeutic modalities recognize the interconnection of cognitive, emotional, physical, and spiritual dimensions of experience. Mindfulness-based approaches cultivate non-judgmental awareness that can hold multiple aspects of experience simultaneously. Internal family systems and other parts work methodologies explicitly address the relationships among different aspects of psyche, rather than focusing on any single dimension. Integrated therapy modalities parallel ritual integration in their recognition that different aspects of experience require different approaches. Sensorimotor psychotherapy, for instance, recognizes that trauma healing may need to begin with physical, earth interventions before emotional, water processing becomes possible, and that cognitive air integration often comes last rather than first in the healing sequence. Parts work, internal family systems, and similar integration methodologies share fundamental principles with traditional elemental integration, despite different terminology and conceptual frameworks. Both approaches recognize that the psyche contains multiple subpersonalities or aspects with different qualities and needs. Both seek to create harmony among these aspects, rather than allowing some to dominate while others are suppressed. Bridging traditional wisdom with contemporary psychological understanding creates particularly powerful approaches to integration. When we understand both the symbolic power of ritual circle casting as a container for wholeness and the neurobiological mechanisms through which multisensory engagement promotes neural integration, we can develop practices that honor both dimensions. To illustrate the complementary relationship between traditional and contemporary approaches to integration, consider a comparison between a traditional integration ritual and a modern psychological technique. In the traditional approach, practitioners might cast a ceremonial circle with elemental correspondences at the four quarters, invoke elemental energies and their associated qualities, move through a series of activities engaging each element in turn. In the contemporary approach, a therapist might guide a client through an internal family systems process of identifying different parts of self, understanding their qualities and needs, and then harmonize these energies through a central ritual that brings them into relationship, facilitating dialogue among them and working toward greater harmony within the internal system. Despite their different external forms, these approaches share fundamental psychological principles. Both recognize the multiplicity within human psychology, different aspects or energies that make up the whole. Both seek to bring conscious awareness to aspects that might otherwise operate outside awareness. Both aim to create more harmonious relationship among different psychological functions rather than allowing imbalance. And both recognize that integration isn't static, but a dynamic, ongoing process of maintaining balance among different elements of psyche. These approaches can complement rather than contradict each other in promoting psychological wholeness. The traditional approach may offer richer symbolism, multi-sensory engagement, and connection to transpersonal dimensions that provide meaning and context for integration work. The traditional approach may offer richer symbolism, multi-sensory engagement, and connection to transpersonal dimensions that provide meaning and context for integration work. The contemporary approach may provide more explicit psychological frameworks, specific language for internal processes, and targeted techniques for addressing particular patterns of imbalance. Bridging worldviews, psychology and spirituality in dialogue, beyond false dichotomies. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to appreciating the full value of elemental practices is the artificial separation of psychological and spiritual perspectives that characterizes much of modern Western thought. This dichotomy, treating practices as either merely psychological or genuinely spiritual, forces a false choice that diminishes both frameworks. Elemental practices work precisely because they engage with multiple dimensions of human experience simultaneously, addressing both psychological mechanisms accessible to scientific study and spiritual dimensions that may transcend current scientific frameworks. The value of maintaining multiple interpretive frameworks lies in the complementary perspectives they provide on human experience. Psychological frameworks offer precision in understanding specific mechanisms of change, testable hypotheses about effects of practices, and connection to broader scientific understanding of human functioning. Spiritual frameworks provide meaning, context, connection to tradition, and recognition of dimensions of experience that may not be fully captured by current scientific paradigms. Research on how worldview affects experience and outcomes suggests that the frameworks through which we interpret practices significantly impact their effects. The meaning ascribed to an experience shapes how we process and integrate it. The expectations we bring to a practice influence what we notice and how we respond. This isn't to suggest that practices only work through belief or placebo effects. Their mechanisms are much more complex than that, but rather that the interpretive framework we bring is itself part of how practices function. Creating space for both scientific and spiritual understanding doesn't require logical contradiction or intellectual compromise. It simply requires recognizing that different frameworks illuminate different aspects of multidimensional human experience. Just as understanding light as both wave and particle provides more complete understanding than either model alone, understanding elemental practices through both psychological and spiritual frameworks allows appreciation of their full complexity and value. Therapeutic applications, clinical use of elemental frameworks. Elemental frameworks have found increasing application in clinical therapeutic contexts. Therapists across various orientations have discovered that elemental language and concepts can provide accessible frameworks for understanding psychological processes that might otherwise remain abstract or inaccessible to clients. Research on the effectiveness of elemental approaches in mental health contexts, while still emerging, shows promising results. Studies of nature-based interventions that explicitly engage with elemental symbolism and experience have shown benefits for depression, anxiety, and trauma recovery. Mindfulness-based approaches that incorporate elemental awareness show enhanced outcomes compared to standard mindfulness protocols in some contexts. Elemental language provides a non-pathologizing framework for discussing psychological patterns. For example, rather than labeling someone with anxiety disorder, a therapist might discuss excess air energy seeking earth for balance. This approach often reduces shame and defensiveness while offering clear direction for intervention. In this case, grounding practices rather than simply trying to eliminate the anxious thoughts. Ethical considerations in bringing spiritual frameworks into therapeutic contexts remain important. Therapists must be careful to respect clients' own belief systems rather than imposing elemental frameworks where they aren't welcome. Clear communication about the optional nature of elemental language, permission to translate between different frameworks, and sensitivity to cultural and religious backgrounds all contribute to ethical integration of elemental approaches in clinical settings. Research frontiers, scientific investigation of traditional practices. Scientific investigation of elemental practices represents an exciting frontier where traditional wisdom and contemporary research methodologies meet. Current research on the effects of various elemental practices shows promising results across multiple domains, from psychological well-being to physiological health to cognitive function. Several specific research protocols have successfully measured outcomes of elemental practices while respecting their integrity as whole systems, rather than reducing them to isolated variables. Heart rate variability studies have documented how grounding practices affect autonomic nervous system regulation, demonstrating physiological mechanisms for the calming and stabilizing effects traditionally attributed to earth connection. EEG measurements during elemental meditations reveal distinct brain activity patterns associated with different elemental focuses. Psychometric assessments of emotional regulation following water practices document measurable improvements in emotional awareness, expression, and regulation. Qualitative research methodologies that preserve experiential integrity while allowing for systematic analysis have proven particularly valuable in studying elemental practices. These research directions inform both traditional practice and psychological application by identifying specific mechanisms through which elemental practices affect human functioning. Rather than debunking traditional claims or reducing spiritual practices to mere psychology, this research helps explain why traditions have preserved these practices across generations and how they might be most effectively applied in contemporary contexts. Conclusion: the art and science of elemental balance. As we've explored the rich landscape of elemental practices across traditions and contemporary approaches, what emerges is not a competition between different frameworks, but a recognition of how diverse approaches to elemental balance share core insights. The value of techniques refined through generations of experiential practice becomes increasingly apparent as scientific research identifies mechanisms through which these traditional approaches affect human functioning. Far from being primitive superstitions or simplistic rituals, elemental practices represent sophisticated technologies for psychological transformation. Technologies developed through centuries of careful observation of how specific practices affect consciousness, emotion, cognition, and behavior. Looking ahead to the detailed exploration of each element in subsequent chapters, this context of multiple complementary frameworks provides important grounding for our journey. We'll examine each element not only through its traditional associations and practices, but also through contemporary psychological understanding of how these elemental energies manifest in human experience. This integrative approach allows us to appreciate both the wisdom of tradition and the insights of modern research without reducing either to the other. The invitation, then, is to explore practices that resonate personally while respecting their origins, to find your own authentic relationship with elemental wisdom without appropriating or distorting traditions that aren't yours. This might mean reclaiming elemental practices from your own ancestral traditions, adapting contemporary psychological approaches to incorporate elemental understanding, or creating new syncretic practices that honor both traditional wisdom and modern insight. Whatever path you choose, the elements themselves offer trustworthy guides for the journey. Earth's grounding stability, water's emotional fluidity, air's mental clarity, and fire's transformative energy working together in the unique ecology of your own being. Journal reflection. Questions. 1. Which elemental practices from various traditions most resonate with your needs and background? 2. How might you integrate insights from both psychological and spiritual perspectives without requiring them to be identical? 3. What benefits might come from maintaining multiple ways of understanding your elemental experiences? 4. How could engagement with traditional practices enhance your psychological approach to elemental balance?